All right, docs, welcome on to the next video. So today in this portion, we're going to go over actually looking at some lab work that will define the things that we talked about as far as diabetes in a bigger viewpoint than what we're just looking at it, which is just traditionally just the idea of, well, your sugars are imbalanced. And that's a part of it. But understand that that's one of the last things that will happen. And there's many more steps that will occur towards that. And we'll even go over a concept of what we call body hardening or body concrete that will go down that you can evaluate and find really early for a patient. And not only would it allow them to get better and to feel better and to make their numbers look better on blood work, which is always a function of this. But one of the bigger things beyond this is to make sure that you can get this solved at the deepest level of cause that you could possibly get to. I find lots of people who have blood sugar level normalized between medications or supplements, but a lot of the underlying causes are still there, which is why they're still taking all of the vitamins or taking all of the medications for a long period of time. So one of the things that we use in Beyond Functional Medicine is what we call our flow chart. This is going to allow us to plug ideas from traditional blood work ideology into an ideology what we use where we're looking about how the body efficiently uses energy. So the flow chart is there so we can plug everything in, all the levels of what we're looking for, all the ratios of what we're looking for are there, what that would mean for the patient for the explanation standpoint, and then, of course, what treatment are we going to tag in using some of the different technologies that we're able to take advantage of in order to get resolutions of some of those problems. But before we jump into all of this, understand that we're looking at this in a microcosm, right? There's all these different things that's going to happen. I'm going to give you like a small piece of it today because it's just not appropriate to do it in this kind of a medium in this length of time. But the basic idea of what we look at and we do in functional medicine and beyond functional medicine more so is that this concept of energetic debt. And an energetic debt is a very simple ideology of that the body has 6 different ways that it makes energy outside of the production from food. And in that ideology that we have energy that the body will spend and energy that the body will make. And in just like in the using the concept of money, we want to spend less than what we make, right? We don't want to have debt. We don't want to have financial debt. We don't want to have energetic debt. Somebody who has energetic debt is going to lead to where parts of their body are going to be dysfunctional. And every chronic disease, I don't care what it is, whether it's neurological, autoimmune, diabetes, has energetic debt as its source underneath the surface. Now, there's different reasons to why that happens, but somewhere the energy is being lost. And ironically, when we talk about energy, people sometimes think about we're talking about weird things or very esoteric things, or wearing funny hats, dancing around open fires. It's not that. It's literally the production of ATP on a cellular level. That's why the ideology of mitochondrial diseases became such a big idea behind the medical syndicate. But the reality of it is that mitochondrial diseases are even caused by a loss of energy. They don't have enough power to run themselves, therefore they can't make ATP. So this is going back to grade school and high school science when talking about the production of ATP on an energetic level, and the research really heavily backs this. But this is one thing that diabetic patients are really forced to do is they don't make ATP well, right? The normal mechanisms that a body would use in order to make a tremendous amount of ATP are compromised. So the body reverts to using sugar, which is an older, significantly less efficient way of making ATP and energy. And then, of course, now there's only a certain amount. So you get this much and you get that much, and your body has to start divvying it out. And eventually somebody's going to get left by the wayside and things start to break down. So when we talk about the concepts of energy and how the body makes energy, this isn't something that's really out there. This is hardcore old school science of ATP. We just know a lot more about it now, of how the body makes it, how the body functions it, and how that applies outside of just the nutritional methodology that typically is what's talked about in functional medicine. That's all that's talked about in functional medicine. So in the concept of what we will call body hardening, it's this cascade that the body will go through to where different metabolic changes will happen, all again caused by the loss of energy in the system, right? Proteins that don't have enough energy in them get hard and they become inflexible. They'll bend wrong and they'll fold wrong. And if they have the wrong type of energy in them, they won't be able to unfold and fold themselves back in the proper alignment. You see that a lot of times in neurological disorders. It's why you have such a huge correlation between Alzheimer's and diabetes. But And you can see in the body hardening charts here, obviously there's 6 steps to this. We're going to only talk about steps 5 and 6. But in step 5, that's where you finally get the diagnosis of diabetes. That's when that finally occurs. Your A1C finally reaches a range of over 6.5. A lot of the times for people, that's when you get the diagnosis of diabetes. A lot of times by the time we find them at this point, they're already jumped over the 7 marker. And traditionally, by research standpoints, 50% of their beta cells in the pancreas have already been destroyed. So typically, when we have type 1 diabetes, you've got somebody who has a destruction of the beta cells. It's usually an autoimmune process that destroys their beta cells, so they can't make insulin. Type 2 diabetes is where you're not using energy efficiently, and then you're therefore forced to get insulin resistance, which then causes an excess use of sugar. But then, of course, now there's a whole other type called type 3 diabetes or type 1.5 diabetes, depending upon the research that you read and what they talk about it as, is where it's a hybrid of the two. Because insulin resistance and using sugar as the main energy source, which is inefficient for a very long period of time, will eventually destroy the beta cells in the pancreas that this shows when we get to step 5. And then now you don't create enough insulin. So now you're in a scenario where you don't make enough insulin. You can't use the insulin that you're getting into the front end portion here. And that takes us right into then stage 6, which is the cognitive decline, the Alzheimer's, the 65% greater chance of getting Alzheimer's with diabetes. They call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes of the brain, where the brain can't efficiently use glucose as an energy source. So this is not just something that affects, just this area or just the blood sugar. This is going to be a global effector where the body is going to catastrophically lose energy in multiple different places until something major fails. Typically, it's the brain. So when we look at blood work in between here, we have triglycerides. Obviously, people will talk about metabolic syndrome. Triglycerides will go up along with the idea of blood sugar as well too. But it's one of the first markers that will go off. And in fact, if you use the ideology of using triglycerides and HDL, your quote unquote good cholesterol, which that's a soapbox for another time about the good and bad portions of cholesterol, where they're all pretty much good as long as they're not damaging. If you look at the ratio between triglycerides and HDL, and it should be 2 to 1, meaning if your triglycerides are 100, your HDL needs to at least be 50. If that ratio is off, the person has insulin resistance. It doesn't matter if their insulin's already high. It doesn't matter if their blood sugar's not high yet. It will be eventually. That's what we call early detection. And insulin is the thing that drives all of this, but we can tell that. Now, again, if you look it up online, it will tell you that if that ratio is out of balance, not only is there insulin resistance, but there's a significantly greater chance of all-cause mortality for the patient as well. So these are important markers to know that never get talked about. They'll talk about HDL and LDL relationships as far as ratios, but the triglyceride to HDL relationship is a massively important one. And it's a window into what's going on with the gut, and it's a window of what's going on with the liver portal and how healthy and clean that is, and energetically how the body's functioning. It's one of the earliest markers. It's one of the early stages of body hardening that we will traditionally find. Now, the other ideas that we look at with this too is, don't forget that, interestingly enough, I have maybe a handful of times somebody who's brought me in their blood sugar levels when they're diabetic, but they also bring me in their insulin levels. Well, just because your blood sugar is normal doesn't mean your insulin is being used efficiently. So we talked about the fact that we could use the triglyceride and HDL ratio in order to find that out. But what if your insulin is sky high? And every night, thanks to different hormones in your body that come across when you're energetically not in bed, okay, so it doesn't happen for most people, it will allow the pancreas to lower the output of insulin so that the pancreas can be healed at that point. If somebody's eating late at night, or if those hormones don't work in turn, and that's something that has to be evaluated very separately, the insulin levels will stay elevated all the time. So if your normal insulin levels, say, are 5, but when we check the insulin levels, it's 30, but the blood sugar is normal, what does that mean? That means we need 6 times the amount of insulin in the body in order to keep the blood sugar normal. In your office, that would mean that you would need 6 times the amount of staff members. So if you had 5 staff members and you needed 30 to run your office efficiently, would it run? Yeah. Would it be efficient? No. Would your overhead go sky high? Yes. Because they're not getting the job done. If you have the right people, maybe you can do it with 5. If you have the wrong people, you can do it with 30. That's what you want to look for, but it never gets run. Insulin never gets run on any of these testings that get brought into me, but it's such an interesting side note because it's talked about in type 1, but not in type 2, but I don't know why not. Now, part of the reason why is the use of metformin over the course of time will cause more insulin So a lot of the times the blood sugar level will come down, but the insulin levels will go up. And it's a common side effect that you'll see with medications. So they don't want to have that conversation with the patient, but we have to know that these things are happening in order to properly manage. We have A1C, which is a great 90-day aggregate blood sugar as well to look at, which again is a number that's a little bit argued over in the medical community. But the one thing I can tell you for sure is based off of research, if somebody's above 5.4 on A1C, regardless of whether they're diabetic or not, if they're above 5.4, it will significantly decrease the amount of neuroplasticity that they're able to achieve. So this is, again, why you get cognitive dysfunctions. The brain hardens. The brain tissue is not meant to harden. Anything over 5.4, and the further above 5.4 you get, the less neuroplasticity you get. So in order to keep your brain healthy and flexible, you need to keep those numbers down. Those are anti-Alzheimer's numbers, as far as we're concerned. And then the interesting thing is, in all the talk about insulin, leptin is the forgotten man. Leptin is the hormone that controls insulin, right? So everyone says, people think they're ahead of the curve when they're saying, well, diabetes isn't a blood sugar disorder, it's an insulin disorder. Sure, but insulin works in the periphery. Leptin is the central nervous system guidance of what insulin should be doing. So really, many times it's a leptin disorder. And you can measure leptin directly on blood work, which is a good symptom of what the sympathetic nervous system is doing as well too. But looking at the ratio on thyroid between free T3 and reverse T3, you got to do a little bit of mathematical, like I listed out here, to kind of find that out, because they're in different ranges and zones when you look at the blood work. But that's the earliest marker that will tell you if somebody has leptin resistance. Now, leptin resistance rarely ever gets talked about in natural medicine because there's no medication for it and there's no supplements for it. There's no supplement that you can give somebody to get them to become not leptin resistant. So it never gets talked about, despite the fact that it's one of the most important, probably the second most important hormone inside of the body across the board. So it's always an interesting thing that looking at these ratios, again, a lot of the times we want it to be nice and clean. If this number means that, that number means that. The ratios mean more to me than almost anything else that shows up. So this is a gentleman who came into my office, and these labs were run by somebody else. And when they brought them into the office, what we wanted to look at here was, they didn't even explain this to him, but this guy was massively anemic, right? They said, here's your blood work. Obviously he was a diabetic. Here's your blood work. And then I flipped to this page, and I'm like, well, what did he tell you about this? Well, he didn't tell me anything about this, but I don't know what this means. I noticed that it was off. That's why I wanted to come and talk to you. So he's not using oxygen. So when a cell's going to make energy in ATP, it's going to either use oxygen, and it's going to get it somewhere in the neighborhood of 38 ATP, or it's going to use sugar, which is going to get it somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 ATP. It's like miles per gallon in a car. You'd rather have 38 miles a gallon than 2. So when we measured a little bit deeper for him and we looked at his iron levels and his anemia markers, I got an alert call from the clinics, from LabCorp, basically telling me that this guy's got an alert low where he's critically low in iron. So he's anemic. He's iron anemic. Turns out when I talked to him about it, his father's iron anemic and had to get infusion. So we had to get this solved for him. And over the course of time, we got all of his iron levels normalized. Well, guess what happened? Once he could start using oxygen, there was no longer a need for a significant amount of excess sugars. Right? Oxygen is one of the major ways the body makes energy in those 6 components that I talked about. So once he could use oxygen, he didn't need to use sugar. So he didn't need to use sugar. Guess what happened to his diabetes? It all normalized. Once we got his leptin and insulin under control, it all normalized. But what would have happened with this guy if we started to starve his body of sugar? Well, now he can't use oxygen for energy. He can't use sugar for energy. The only thing that's left is he has to start catabolizing his own tissues to try to create energy that way. And in his case scenario, that was not going to be a healthy thing. It was just going to create more debt and make him sicker as time went on. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about taking a 90-foot view of energy creation in the body and looking at it with a bigger picture ideology to make sure that the body is making enough energy across the board. This is something that we see all the time in neuropathies too, where with neuropathies, they'll have, 15% to 35% of all neuropathies are caused by diabetes, but a lot more of them are because their insulin is really high. And that causes them to have systemic neuropathy. It's a central neuropathy that looks like a peripheral neuropathy, gets misdiagnosed as a peripheral neuropathy. If you have diabetic patients and they have neuropathy, ask them how many have it on both sides. One side may be worse than the other, but almost all of them have it in both legs, both feet. When you have it on both sides like that, that's almost always a central neuropathy. So it could still be a diabetic neuropathy. Their blood sugar is just normal at that point. So hopefully this kind of takes us down a little bit of the rabbit hole. Again, I'm giving you a snapshot into a view of how you would look at something like this in a much more complicated case and much bigger, but it all comes down to supply and demand of energy. The more energy you have in your system, the better things go, and the more leeway you have to cheat and do things. Most people, when they're in chronic disease, they're not even living paycheck to paycheck anymore. They are full on in energetic debt, and eventually the system is going to call bankruptcy. Every single chronic disease, again, I don't care what it is, has an underlying cause of energetic debt. Okay, that is just the reality of the world that we live in. If somebody puts you in the corner and says, what causes all disease? It's energetic debt on some level, and everyone's version of it and pattern of it is going to be a little bit different. That's why we need systems to evaluate deeper all of those ways. And it's looking at blood work in different ways and using some other tests to evaluate the 6 different ways that the body makes energy. And then treatment protocols aimed at restoring energy to whichever one of those 6 processes, of all of those 6 processes, that the person is struggling. If you can do that, at that point, and only at that point, is when the person is going to start to get to a point where they can start healing. Okay? But once beyond that point, it's not going to work that way. So I hope this makes sense. If you have any questions, let us know. If you want more information about what we're doing and how we're able to get results with some of these different kind of problems, click the links below, set up some time to talk to some of our team members, and they'll walk you through all the different processes of beyond functional medicine. I hope this was helpful. We'll see you on another recording.